Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome, and if you're returning, I am glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Today we are doing one of our quick builds, where we'll be exploring a briefly summarized character build for D&D. As always with our quick builds, if there's ever a build you'd like to see me explore in the future, be sure to let me know in the comments below. For today's video, I am going to cheat a little bit and combine two requests into one. See, the concept for today's video comes in part from IGRGIC1, who wanted to see a build that optimized the Battlerager Barbarian's spiked armor damage. Meanwhile, the other half of our build comes from Ambrose Dystopian 1542. Ambrose wanted to see a build that combined Barbarian with Artificer to get a Mad Max type of character. One who would be a scrapper, able to scavenge and find various items, tools, and bits and pieces of things that they could salvage into weapons, armor, or other equipment. They could also then be a scrapper in the combat sense, utilizing Barbarian resistance, rage, Artificer utility, or even potentially healing, and perhaps even put icing on the cake with the Armor of Agathys spell. I figured it would be easiest and thematic to combine both of these builds conceptually into one. After all, what could be more Mad Max than a character that runs around in spiked armor? And if we're looking to increase the damage of our spiked armor, maybe Artificer will have some answers for us. The one thing to note though is that I will be going down two separate paths, even though this is conceptually one solid build. The reason for that is because of one major caveat. The spiked armor that the Battlerager gets, specifically the spikes of the spiked armor, are not weapons. They do not count as simple weapons or martial weapons, and because of that, it becomes really hard to actually increase their damage. Because of that, I am going to present one build path that assumes that we have talked to our DM and they've allowed us to count spikes as a simple or martial melee weapon. The other path is going to assume that we can't actually count it as a weapon, and we're going to need to find other ways in order to increase that damage that we deal with those spikes. And the last thing to talk about before jumping into the build is that yes, I will be using 2024 rules, because overall, 2024 still provides a lot of other quality of life improvements to the Battlerager that I think breathe new life into this subclass. So with all that said, let's jump into the build. Starting off the building character creation with our origin, we are going to be an orc, if we are able to use our spikes on our spiked armor as weapons. Personally, I like the idea of being an orc because it throws a little bit of Blood Bowl theme into the mix, while also being a mechanically advantageous species for our build. And I haven't used 2024 orc yet, so I did want to throw them in as well. However, like I said, this is assuming we can use the spikes as a weapon. If we can't use the spikes as a weapon, we actually already have our first alternate choice. We're either going to want to be an Aasimar or a Goliath. The reason is because these two species both have distinct ways in order to add damage to generic attacks, not weapon attacks, not spell attacks, just attack rolls, which our spiked armor does count as. Going to our background, we're either going to want to be a sailor or more likely pick an older background from a previous book with backwards compatibility in order to pick up the ability score improvement and origin feat that we want, or use a custom background from the 2024 DMG. No matter how you get there, we're definitely going to want the following ability scores. We want 17 strength, putting 9 points into it, as well as a +2 from our background. We're going to want 14 dexterity, putting 7 points there. We're going to want 14 constitution as well, by putting 5 points into it to get to 13, and another 1 point from our background to round it up to 14. We're going to want to put 5 points into intelligence in order to get that to 13 for multiclassing. And finally, we can put our last point into either wisdom or charisma to get us 9 in either of those and 8 in the other one. One little asterisk to those ability scores though is the fact that depending on which path we go, we actually may want to swap intelligence and charisma just for multiclassing minimums. Lastly, for our origin feat, we're going to want Tavern Brawler, whether we count our spikes as weapons or not. It's going to come in handy on both builds. Jumping into the actual level breakdown of the build now, we're going to look at tiers 1 through 4. So tier 1 is levels 1 to 5, tier 2 is levels 6 to 10, so on and so forth. First off, in tier 1, levels 1 to 5, if we can count our spikes as weapons, we're going to be a Barbarian 3, an Artificer 1, and a Fighter 1. If we cannot count our spikes as weapons, we're actually going to swap out our Artificer levels for Warlock. Starting with the path that doesn't include our spikes as weapons, this is rules as written, us just using our spikes for the bonus action and trying to get other ways to add damage to them. We want to be a Barbarian 3 so we can actually start wearing spiked armor. Warlock is going to give us the Armour of Agathys spell that was part of the request. Honestly, it's a nice spell for us to have overall, since it'll give us temporary hit points plus some retaliate damage. The one thing is that in 2024, Armour of Agathys is now a bonus action, so it does actually conflict with Rage a little bit, given that we're going to have to cast it first and then next turn Rage, whereas before we could have technically done it all in the same turn. Fighter gives us the unarmed fighting style, which does actually pair kind of nicely with the Battlerager as a whole, since the Battlerager does gain minor bonuses to grappling. That will kind of be part of our playstyle in that we're going to want to run up, hit some enemies with our unarmed strikes, grapple them, and then use our bonus action to smash them into our spiked armor. Jumping back to the other path where we can assume that our spikes actually will count as weapons, we're taking Artificer instead because eventually we'll get infusions, and if our spikes can count as their own weapons, we can add infusions to them, increasing their damage, their accuracy, you name it. That will be extremely helpful for us. We do lose out on Armour of Agathys, but we still pick up all the other same things that our other path does. We get Fighter for unarmed fighting because we're still going to want to grapple enemies. We can run up, make an unarmed strike, grapple an enemy, deal automatic 3 piercing damage to that enemy thanks to our Battlerager feature. And of course, this is where the first quality of life improvement can be seen. It's the fact that in 2024, the distinction between magical and non-magical piercing, bludgeoning, and slashing damage appears to be removed. Now, that measly 3 piercing damage we deal whenever we grapple an enemy is always going to be 3 damage. The only time it won't be is if the enemy genuinely has resistance to piercing damage. Otherwise, it's just a passive bonus whenever we grapple an enemy. Jumping into tier 2 with our first path, the rules as written path that does not allow our spikes to be used as weapons. Well, for us, we are going to be a Barbarian 5 at this point, Warlock 4, and still Fighter 1. For Warlock subclass, if you want to add more damage onto your spiked armor, we're going to have to be a Hexblade. Hexblade's curse, when applied to an enemy, increases damage rolls, flat out, by an amount equal to our proficiency bonus. The one unfortunate thing about going Hexblade instead of any other Warlock subclass is I really would have wanted to go Fiend in order to say that we made a pact with a speed demon. As far as invocations go for being a Warlock, honestly, any that you like are going to work well. We probably want something like Devil's Sight, maybe False Life for extra temporary hit points. Both builds and the way they break down are going to end up getting lots of sources of temporary hit points, but none of those sources are going to be really large. One notable combo that you can do is with the 2024 version of Armour of Agathys. That spell says that as long as we have temporary hit points, not temporary hit points from the spell itself, but just temporary hit points in general, we get the retaliate damage. Now, there is some debate on whether or not if you cast the spell first and then later get a bigger source of temporary hit points, would switching from the Agathys temporary HP to the new source of temporary HP count as dropping to 0 for an instant second? Honestly, we're not worried about that, because what we could do instead is use Fiendish Vigor to cast False Life with our action, which gives us a maximum 12 temporary HP casually, and then after doing that, cast Armour of Agathys as a bonus action, which provides us its own temporary HP and the retaliate damage. But we don't actually need to accept the temporary HP from Armour of Agathys at all. So if we ignore that part, based on the wording of the spell, we do still gain the retaliate damage, and we've just effectively gotten double the amount of temporary hit points in relation to a first level casting of the spell. combo is really only going to be good for lower levels, and eventually we will be casting at a high enough level that we're going to gain more temporary hit points from there rather than false life, and that is perfectly fine too. Looking back at path 2, where we're allowed to assume that our spikes count as weapons, we're going to be a Barbarian 5 still, a Fighter 1 still, and an Artificer 4. We still gain 2 feats as well as infusions and our Artificer subclass. Obviously, since in this path we're assuming that our spikes can count as weapons, we're going to put an infusion on those spikes to buff their accuracy as well as their damage. I'm going to go Artillerist because with Artillerist we have a little more utility where we can bring in our Eldritch Cannon. Thematically, it's like we have salvaged together a bunch of various pieces and parts in order to make this cannon. The best options for the cannon to use in combat are going to be either the flamethrower or the protection cannon, since even though they do scale off of our intelligence, they aren't impacted too much by having a poor intelligence, which we do. The flamethrower is an AoE that still deals half damage on a successful saving throw, so that's flat out nice for dealing damage. Finally, it's time to talk about the feats. The feats we're going to take on both paths no matter what, which is why I left them till here, and they are the Grappler feat and the Charger feat. We are taking a page out of our Wrestler Monk, where these two feats synergize really well with unarmed strikes. Both of them are going to let us improve our strength, which is a nice bonus. Then we're also going to be able to run up, hit an enemy with the Grappler feat, and choose to deal both damage and attempt to grapple that enemy once per turn. If we do end up grappling that enemy, they're taking damage from the unarmed strike, as well as our flat 3 from being a Battlerager. We can move with them and our speed isn't impeded, which is amazing, and we also have permanent advantage against that enemy specifically. No reckless attack required. Charger synergizes very nicely in the same way it did with our Wrestler Monk, where we're going to gain extra damage or a push ability onto those initial unarmed strikes. If we run up to an enemy, we hit them with the unarmed strike and we want to grapple them, then we can deal a little extra damage. If we don't want to, then we could instead push them and maybe combine that push with the Tavern Brawler push. The last thing to mention is the mobility buff, which Charger allows us to increase our speed by 10 feet whenever we take the dash action. This is where being an orc comes into play, Adrenaline Rush to dash as a bonus action, and they gain temporary hit points for doing so. Getting a flat 10-foot speed boost for that special bonus action is a very nice bonus. Going into tier 3 now, both our paths are going to start to converge, given that we're no longer leveling up our Artificer or Warlock levels. We're going to go to Barbarian 10, Artificer or Warlock 4, and still keep that 1 level in Fighter. What we get from Barbarian here is Reckless Abandon at level 6. We're also going to get an extra feat, which does have a bit of a choice for us. Finally, we're also going to get Battlerager Charge. First off, let's start with Reckless Abandon. Reckless Abandon says that whenever we use Reckless Attack, we gain temporary hit points equal to our Constitution modifier. That's not a whole lot, but it basically functions as a sort of damage reduction for us. Now, we already have a lot of sources of temporary HP no matter which way we swing this build. If we are path 2, the Orc, who counts their spikes as weapons, and is also an Artificer. We have the Protection Cannon, Adrenaline Rush from being an Orc, and now this feature as well. So we'll have lots of little instances of temporary HP. If we are path 1, that plays rules as written and does not count spikes as weapons, then we have Armour of Agathis, possibly Fiendish Vigor, giving us false life as well. Those are going to be larger instances of temporary HP than what Reckless Abandon can offer us. The nice thing that Reckless Abandon does offer us, though, is a bonus which we might want to use with Reckless Attack in order to trigger Brutal Strike. Brutal Strike says that if we use Reckless Attack, we can forgo advantage on one strength-based attack roll of our choice on our turn. But if that attack hits, then we deal an extra d10 of damage with a weapon or an unarmed strike, and we can use one brutal effect of our choice. Now, the thing to say about this is, number 1, Brutal Strike actually does work with Grappler because it just says we have to use Reckless Attack and then forgo advantage. It doesn't say we have to forgo the advantage that we got specifically from Reckless Attack. So if we have an enemy grappled and we have advantage against them, we can use Reckless Attack, gain the temporary HP, gain the Brutal Strike benefits, and then forgo our Grappler advantage in order to trigger Brutal Strike. Before we talk about the feat, since that is another choice, let's go quickly over Battlerager Charge. Battlerager Charge says that when raging, we can dash as a bonus action. This is really nice extra mobility if we aren't an orc. Orcs, as I have said, already get that ability through Adrenaline Rush, and Adrenaline Rush can be used a number of times equal to our proficiency bonus, and they come back on a short or long rest. We probably will have enough in our back pocket that we don't actually need Battlerager Charge. If we're not an orc though, this provides some nice extra mobility that we can use in a pinch, and Charger will synergize with it very nicely. Whether or not we're actually going to be using it often is up to you, but having it is very helpful. Finally, the last thing to talk about in Tier 3 is our feats. For Path 1, assuming that we cannot count our spikes as weapons, the choice is pretty simple. We are taking a half feat that rounds off our strength to cap it at 20, and that is Mage Slayer. It gives us a mini legendary resistance in the form of being able to choose to succeed on a failed mental saving throw. That alone is reason enough to take this feat in my mind, but the added bonus comes in the form of Concentration Breaker. Concentration Breaker says that whenever we damage an enemy, and that enemy has to make a concentration saving throw, they have disadvantage on the concentration save. We can run up to an enemy that is concentrating on a spell or other effect, and we can hit them with an unarmed strike. Then, with Grappler, we can choose to deal damage and grapple them at the same time. Assuming that grapple succeeds, they're going to take damage and have to make a concentration save based on the unarmed strike itself, but also we have that extra 3 piercing damage coming in behind from being a Battlerager. And since that is a separate source of damage from our unarmed strike, that will trigger a second concentration save with disadvantage if they even succeed on the first one. Looking at Path 2 though, we have a more interesting choice. Mage Slayer still provides all the same benefits for us that is for Path 1. The difference is that we also could get Gift of the Chromatic Dragon. Gift of the Chromatic Dragon says that as a bonus action, we can choose a simple or martial weapon to imbue with one damage type of our choice from the list. For the next minute, that weapon will deal an extra d4 damage of the chosen type. So, if we can't count our spikes as weapons, this feat is completely useless to us. But if we can, it's pretty tempting to pick up since it is going to double our damage with those spikes. Going into our final tier, Tier 4 now, we are Barbarian 14, Artificer or Warlock 4, and Fighter 2. We take Fighter 2 to get Action Surge. Let's talk about what Barbarian 14 gets us. It gets us an extra feat, which we will probably want to either round off our strength or increase our constitution, depending on what our stats are looking like at the current time. And the unfortunate thing about this is that that final ability score improvement is coming online a little bit too early to be able to pick up an epic boon. The thing we do get for both builds though is Spiked Retribution. Back when there was that distinction between magical and non-magical piercing damage, this could be flat out useless. Now, with that distinction gone, hopefully we'll get more value out of this and we can feel like we actually have a passive retaliate feature that's just always going to deal 3 damage to an enemy when they hit us with a melee attack. And that's the second half about this feature that's actually not that bad. It just specifies melee attack. It doesn't say it has to be with a weapon, an unarmed strike, or even a spell. If you go up and grapple a spellcaster and they try to shocking grasp you or use some other melee attack spell, they're gonna take 3 damage and get punished for us. If you go up against an enemy monk and they're gonna try and unleash a flurry of blows against you, they're taking 3 damage each time they hit you. This can really add up. Is it the greatest capstone feature? No, but it is still neat to see how it got revamped in 2024. And other than that, that's the build. Overall, regardless of which path you take, I think will definitely feel like a character from the Mad Max universe or a character from Blood Bowl. The reason I think we feel a bit more related to Mad Max is because we would have to be insane to play a 2024 build all the way to level 20 and not take an epic boon. I didn't do it for the sake of this video as presented, just to talk about what the Battlerager really fully gets in 2024. Though obviously, all you have to do is either drop levels in Fighter or 2 levels in Barbarian and you'll be able to grab an epic boon, no question. If you were to pick up an epic boon, I would highly recommend Irresistible Offense in order to bypass piercing resistance, because that will once again synergize with Battlerager Barbarian and their spiked armor, and that is probably the last quality of life improvement that a Battlerager can get. Hopefully the build has sounded interesting to you. I know it may have been a little confusing jumping back and forth between Path 1 and Path 2, but really the only distinguishing factor between the two is whether or not you and your DM can agree, or would agree, that the spiked armor can be used as a simple or martial weapon. If it can't, we still have a fine build that's able to grapple enemies, deal some automatic damage, use the bonus action to deal damage from spiked armor, and we can increase that damage in a few different ways. If we are allowed to use it as a weapon, then we're in an even better spot because we can gain a bunch of features that improve our weapon damage. Honestly, I think we feel like a dirty scrapper type character no matter which way we spin it. With that said, let me know what you thought of the build, or what you would add or change to get closer to the theme of a Mad Max Scrapper character, or a Barbarian Artificer, or how you would boost the Battlerager's damage. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.